The last 24 hours has seen more fighting on the Ukrainian front lines, with more Ukrainian attacks in the Rabotino sector of the Zaporozhye front lines, Russian counterattack on the Vremevsky Ledge, and more intense Ukrainian attacks near the town of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, towards the village of Klesheyevka. I will come and discuss these fights, these battles, shortly, but I will first discuss the event which has overshadowed them, which is the enormous continuing Russian missile strikes on Odessa. Now, yesterday I said that the strike that had taken place the night before on against Odessa seemed to be slightly less in intensity than the previous 3 nights of strikes. That doesn't seem to have been true of the missile strike which took place last night. That seems to have been, again, extremely intense. Once more, supersonic missiles, Onyx missiles were used. And over the course of this missile strike on Odessa, which took place last night, the first report of a civilian casualty took place. One of the most astonishing things about these Russian missile strikes overall is how few civilians have died in them. And I'm not talking just specifically about the missile strikes against Odessa, but the generality of the missile strikes across the entire course of the war. And until last night, as the Russian military commentator Boris Rozhin, the person who writes under the name Colonel Kassad, has pointed out, until the strike that took place last night, Ukraine hadn't actually reported any civilian casualties from the Russian missile strikes whatsoever. Now, this is really very remarkable, and it is in stark contrast to what has happened in most other wars that I've tracked. I mean, I remember the fighting, for example, that took place in places like Aleppo and Mosul during the various wars that took place in the Middle East. And of course, the 2 wars that the United States fought against Saddam Hussein, and the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. And of course, all the many wars that Israel has fought over the time that, ever since its establishment. One can't say that over the course of those wars, there were no civilian casualties of whatsoever in missile strikes against a particular city. And even allowing for the fact that there have been definitely civilian deaths and injuries over the course of the entire war in various missile strikes which have taken place, it is remarkable how few relatively there have been. Now, the only explanation for this is that the Russians must be going out of their way to avoid inflicting civilian casualties. I stress that when discussing civilian casualties, I've been looking at Ukrainian claims. Every so often, a residential building gets hit. More often than not, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most people who've tracked the war closely and who don't just accept Ukrainian accounts, more often than not, when civilian buildings, residential buildings have been struck and civilians have been killed, it's either debris from shot down missiles or caused by a missile that has been hit and has gone astray, or it has been a case of Ukrainian air defense missiles falling to earth as they have missed their target and striking residential buildings in consequence. But even if one allows for the possibility that all of those strikes on residential buildings have in fact been by Russian missiles, it still overall is remarkably few cases of such strikes and remarkably few civilian casualties altogether. So, to repeat, it does look as if the Russians have been trying to avoid inflicting large numbers of civilian casualties as a result of their missile strikes. And I have to say, it does speak of a certain precision on the part of these missiles that the Russians have been using. I have been one of these people who, in the past, has been, to put it mildly, skeptical about the effectiveness of precision-guided weapons. Well, over the course of this war, we've seen some evidence that at least some weapons, which are called precision-guided weapons, are indeed very accurate indeed. I have to say, and this is also something that must be pointed out, that it's clear that Ukraine itself, the Ukrainian authorities, have been, or must have been, fairly efficient in organising the evacuation of civilian casualties and arranging shelters and those kind of things. Every so often we hear reports about how Ukrainian officials have embezzled funds for shelters and things like that, but to some extent at least, they too must be taking appropriate precautions to try to minimise civilian casualties. So I think this is something that ought to be said about this war, given how long it's gone on for, given how intense the missile strikes and the bombing has been at various times. Casualty numbers among civilians have been remarkably low. And coming back to this missile strike on Odessa, last night was, to my knowledge, the first day when it was confirmed that a civilian was killed. So, given that we've had 5 days of strikes now, as I said, that is actually remarkable given previous history and telling as well. Now, having said that, there was a spectacular piece of damage on one specific building, and that was the Preobrazhensky Cathedral, one of the Orthodox cathedrals in the city of Odessa. A missile hit it, broke through the roof, went through the basement, caused an explosion. Some internal walls buckled and broke. And though from the pictures I've seen, it's an exaggeration to say that the entire building has been destroyed, it has suffered extremely heavy damage, and restoration work, if it ever takes place, will no doubt take a long time and will require a lot of resources, and the extent to which, of course, the building can be fully restored to its original appearance will depend both on who carries out that restoration and on the resources that they commit to it. Now, again, there's been a lot of finger pointing, people blaming each other as to who was responsible for this destruction of the Preobrazhensky Cathedral. I am obviously not on location. I cannot speak with absolute certainty on an issue like this. As I say a great many times, in order to establish culpability, if that is the right word, that would require an independent investigation of a sort that it is inconceivable would ever take place, given the war that is ongoing in Ukraine. But I'm going to make a few, I think, fairly obvious observations of my own. Odessa is a city which has historically considers itself to be proudly Russian. The Russians believe that the population of Odessa is strongly sympathetic to Russia, which I suspect is true. The Preobrazhensky Cathedral is an Orthodox cathedral, in other words, where Orthodoxy is practiced. I think it is inconceivable that the Russians would deliberately target a cathedral of this kind, and I think that this possibility, frankly, can be discounted entirely. Either this was a missile that went astray, a Russian missile that wasn't meant astray, perhaps because it was partially intercepted by a Ukrainian air defense missile, or more likely, and this does seem to be a widespread view, it was another case of a Ukrainian air defense missile being launched, hitting its target, falling back to Earth, and causing the damage that we have seen. So that's my view. It's a preliminary view. As I said, if there were ever to be an investigation, we would no doubt establish the truth. I doubt that, as I said, an investigation that would satisfy everybody, or indeed even most people, will ever happen. But that, at least, is my view, and I think it is the most plausible explanation of what happened. Now, Preobrazhensky Cathedral is a tragedy, but let's talk about the purpose of these missile strikes on Odessa and their effectiveness. And there are two schools of thought here. One school of thought says that Ukraine has been using Odessa as an arsenal to stock up weapons from the West and indeed other weapons. It's located reasonably close to Ukraine's western borders. It has very good road and railway connections. A lot of the weapon systems that come through the West perhaps transit through Odessa because it's a port. It has extensive warehouses and holding facilities where weapons could be stored. And over and above and beyond that, it has been protected from missile strikes, at least to a certain degree, at least this theory goes, as a result of the grain deal. Now, it's important to say that there have been missile strikes on Odessa at various times, even whilst the grain deal has been in existence. So it's not true to say that there have been no missile strikes at all during that time, but none on the scale that we have been witnessing over the last 5 days. And I would say also that I suspect that specific missile strikes on the port of Odessa and on its various holding and warehouse facilities, well, we probably haven't seen that for many, many months now. So it's not impossible that Ukraine has taken advantage of the grain deal to store large amounts of Western military equipment and also perhaps other things like fuel used by armoured vehicles and such things, that it's done so in the port of Odessa. And with the grain deal out of the way, it would make complete sense for the Russians to clear up this stockpile, to destroy it completely. And the fact that the attacks are going on day after day perhaps gives us some clue, if this theory is correct, of how big this stockpile must have been. I would also add that the Russians have been launching missiles against an important bridge in Odessa. Apparently this bridge has not yet been destroyed, and it's not quite clear exactly how strong the attacks on this bridge actually are, but it is believed to be, or it is reported to be, a bridge which is used for railway and other traffic, supplying military equipment to Ukraine from the west. The equipment would pass over this bridge into Odessa, and it would presumably then be stockpiled in this port area. Well, as I said, that's one theory. The second theory is a very intriguing one, and amongst those who appear to support it is the Swiss Army officer Jacques Bord, who has been one of the most insightful, in my opinion, commentators about the direction of the war. And according to this view, this is a softening up operation on Odessa in preparation for the Battle of Odessa, which is to come. Nobody's giving a timeline for that, at least not that I've seen. But the suggestion is that sooner or later, the Russians intend to launch some kind of operation to capture Odessa. And this missile offensive against Odessa is in preparation for this. Now, as I say many times, the Russian General Staff, the Russian military leadership, do not share their plans with me, and I'm not going to try to adjudicate between these two views. I will say a number of things. The first is that they are not mutually exclusive. It would make entire sense for the Russians to strike the port of Odessa in order to clear out whatever stockpiles of weapons Ukraine has located there. And if they haven't been able to do that for a long time because Ukraine has in effect been protected by the grain deal, well, it is completely understandable that they would make up for lost time and start doing it now. So that is one. So at the same time, there's no reason at all why the Russians might not want to undertake a missile offensive as well, because they have some sort of long-term plan to capture the city. In fact, I suspect they do have such a plan. And note, they have in effect said that they are treating a body of water in the Black Sea, a large body of water in the Black Sea south of Odessa, as a contested zone. That is partly, undoubtedly, creating some kind of blockade of Ukrainian ports, Black Sea ports, as I've discussed before. But of course, it could also be that eventually this body of water will be used as a springboard for some kind of amphibious landing against Odessa. Who's to know? Now, as I said, whether this is something that's planned for the short term or the medium term or the long term, if of course it is even planned at all, I do not know, and I completely lack the necessary military background to be able to even provide an educated guess as to when it might happen. Anyway, major missile strikes against Odessa, and a number of just further points to make. There's no doubt that the Odessa air defense system has collapsed. Ukraine has regularly made extraordinarily bold claims about the number of Russian missiles and drones it shoots down. I remember reading some months ago on the official Russian TASS news agency, a Russian official, an anonymous Russian official, explained to TASS that Ukraine regularly claims to have shot down more Russian missiles than Russia has launched on any particular strike. But anyway, that's what the Russians say. I've myself often expressed skepticism about Ukrainian claims about the number of missiles that they shoot down. But even in Odessa, perhaps because the evidence of destruction from the missiles is too great, Ukraine is now admitting that more than half of the missiles, at the very least, get through. And it's been suggested that one of the reasons that this is happening is that though Odessa has always been treated by Ukraine as a high priority air defense area, most Ukrainian air defense assets have now been concentrated around Kiev. Ukraine's formerly most impressive air defense system, a legacy of the Soviet era, has now been catastrophically depleted. It's even been suggested that instances where air defense missiles in and around Odessa fall to earth and cause the kind of damage that we've just seen at the Preobrazhensky Cathedral, that they might be the result of Ukraine having increasingly to rely upon old missiles left over from the early 1980s that are no longer fully reliable and which have in fact deteriorated to the point that they are subject to even more malfunctions than usual. And of course, it's also clear that Western air defense assets have not been especially effective, or have not been effective at all, in defending Odessa. And, by the way, bring me now to comments made by General Milley, they've not been effective on the battlefields either. Just as Ukraine doesn't seem able to shoot down most of the Russian missiles that are launched against Odessa, so Ukraine has failed up to now to shoot down a single combat attack helicopter or jet fighter or bomber undertaking ground attack operations on the Ukrainian battlefronts in southern Ukraine or in Donbass. In fact, the number of Russian aircraft that get shot down by Ukraine seems to have declined to a dribble. So, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, they might be telling us all that the single most important thing about this war, the reason why F-16s aren't going to change anything in the war, is because both Russia and Ukraine have extremely potent air defense systems, and it's not really possible for fighter jets like the F-16 to operate effectively in this sort of environment. Well, that is certainly true of the Russians, but as Sullivan and Milley must know, it is not true of Ukraine, and hasn't been true of Ukraine for some months now, and certainly not for the period when this offensive that's going on the front lines in the south and in the east has been underway. So now that brings me to the topic of the offensive. What's actually going on in the offensive, what's been happening over the last 24 hours. And as I said, there were more Ukrainian attacks south of Orechov towards Rabotino. Rabotino seems to have become one of those places, a little bit like Bakhmut before, which has become almost an obsession for Ukraine. I'm not, as I said, somebody able to judge on the tactical significance of these places like Rabotino, but it is a small place, little more than a village. It's deserted. It's not, absolutely not, part of the great Russian fortified lines, the Surovikin line, which, to repeat again, lies well to the south of where all the fighting has been taking place. Nonetheless, Ukraine makes attack after attack, trying to capture this place. The pattern endlessly repeats itself. Sometimes it attacks with light infantry, with artillery preparation. Sometimes it tries to send armored forces to try to capture this place with armor. In every single case, the Ukrainian attackers get heavily shelled by Russian artillery. They get caught up in minefields, which the Russians seem to have no difficulty laying more of or reseeding after each Ukrainian attack. The attack is repulsed. There are heavy losses. Photos and pictures appear of burnt out Bradleys, and, as happened last night, of Leopard 2s burning on the steppes. I can't say necessarily, by the way, I can't absolutely confirm that these pictures relate necessarily to yesterday's fighting, but there were more of these pictures appearing last night. And in fact, there's also been pictures showing the battlefield around Rabotino, and you can see the burnt out wrecks of large numbers of armoured vehicles dotting the landscape, pretty much all of them, as far as I can tell, Ukrainian, a significant proportion of them Bradleys, and I saw a picture of a burnt out, or at least a partly burnt out, Leopard 2 as well. Incidentally, Germany and Poland have now resolved their argument about the refurbishment, the repair of damaged Ukrainian Leopard 2s. There's a facility being created now in Rzeszów in Poland. Apparently it's received its first 2 Leopard 2s that from Ukraine, which need to be repaired. Other Leopard 2s, however, as is clear to me from the pictures, have been damaged beyond repair. And anyway, the loss of them continues as before. So that was the fight at Rabotino. On the Remevsky Ledge, it was the Russians who were on the attack. This is another area well to the north of the Surovikin line, which Ukraine, in my opinion, tried to capture on the first day of the offensive on the 4th of June. And it hasn't succeeded. It holds several villages there. It's occupied several villages there, but it's never succeeded in pushing the Russians completely off the Remevsky Ledge, despite the fact that this is apparently a difficult area to hold. Roads into and out of it are few and don't lead to many obvious places, but the Russians nonetheless did establish positions on the Remevsky Ledge. The Ukrainians have attacked them there, but they've never managed to capture the Remevsky Ledge, even though, as I said before, I'm fairly sure that Ukraine expected that it would be able to drive the Russians completely off the Remevsky Ledge in the big armoured assaults that took place on the 4th of June, over the course of which Ukraine suffered extremely heavy losses in armoured vehicles and manpower. Anyway, now it's the Russians who are counterattacking. I don't think the Russians have any plan to push the Ukrainians entirely off the Vremevsky ledge, but by counterattacking, they're making the Ukrainian positions rather more difficult. Anyway, so that's the story in the main area of the Ukrainian offensive, or at least that part of the offensive, which is supervised by General Zaluzhny, the overall Ukrainian military commander. That's what's happening on the southern front lines. In Donbass, where General Syrskyi seems to be in charge, and specifically in the Bakhmut area, there were apparently last night particularly intense Ukrainian attempts to break through towards Kleshayevka, this hotly contested village southwest of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. And it's not, again, entirely easy to get a full picture of what happened, but the Russians, the Russian Defense Ministry, and various Russian war reporters all agree that the attack failed, that again, Ukraine suffered heavy losses, and there's said to be pictures, though I haven't seen them, once more, of large numbers of knocked out Ukrainian armoured vehicles in this area, all the result of this failed attack. So that was what happened near Artyomovsk. Ukrainians continue to attack in this area. They have substantial forces. They were numbered at 67,000 about a week ago. This is specifically in the Bakhmut area. It's not entirely clear how many Russian forces there are. I heard a report some time ago from the Ukrainians that there were about 50,000 Russian troops defending in this area. They've been reinforced by Chechen fighters, perhaps around 10,000 of those. Could be that the size of the forces is about equal, but it's clear that the Russians hold the advantage again. Now, further north, around Kupiansk, Izium, Liman, that Svatovo Kremenaya, that part of the battlefield. Again, last night, there were reports that the Russians have made further advances in that usual methodical, incremental way that they do, that they've been successfully now pushing Ukrainian troops out of various forested areas, that they've been brushing off various Ukrainian counterattacks. But it's clear that so far there's been no outright assault by the Russian military on Kupiansk or on Liman, though, as I've said, they do seem to be now extremely close to both of those towns. But so far, they've not made attempts to storm those towns in the way that the Ukrainians tend to do whenever they get close to towns that the Russians control. So, methodical, steady, incremental Russian advance in the north, total standstill everywhere in the south and in Bakhmut, where Ukraine has been attacking. Now, there's been a rather more commentaries and discussions about what's happening in the offensive. First thing to say is that President Zelensky has said, or he said a couple of days ago addressing a conference in Colorado, which Jake Sullivan also attended, that the Ukrainian offensive hasn't really begun yet, that large forces remain in reserve, and that the Ukrainians are now approaching the time when a big attack, the breakthrough attempt, will happen. Now, that's what Zelensky has said. It's been taken up and repeated now by various Western officials. Tony Blinken, for example, the Secretary of State, has just made essentially the same comments, that the fact that the offensive, that its progress up to now has been disappointing, that's the usual euphemism you get from Western reporters, but one shouldn't place too much weight on that, because supposedly the big advance, the big offensive hasn't yet happened. And we get reports that the Russians are rationing their use of ammunition, that they're outranged by Ukrainian guns, and that the Ukrainians have superiority in weight of guns, that Ukrainian howitzers are more powerful than Russian howitzers and can outrange Russian guns. This is a repeat, by the way, of claims that were made at the time when the M777s were being delivered to Ukraine in June of last year. Is there any truth to this claim? Well, I hardly think so, because no less a person than General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian commander himself, has contradicted this. He says that, in fact, it's the Russians who have the clear-cut superiority in artillery power, and I'm sure that is right. And it is also the United States and Ukraine which recently said, or at least the United States said, that Ukraine has almost run out of 155mm ammunition, and that the United States has run out of its stockpiles of 155mm ammunition, and that it is therefore obliged to supply Ukraine with cluster munitions. And I've discussed in various programs how US military officers, people like Douglas McGregor, Daniel Davis, Scott Ritter, who've actually worked with cluster munitions, are all unanimous in saying that these cluster munitions, which are what Ukraine appears to be increasingly using, that these cluster munitions are not really effective against fortified positions, such as those that the Russians have, or even indeed against armored columns. They're really intended for use against lighter trucks, unarmored vehicles, and infantry moving across the ground. Anyway, so as I said, we've sadly heard that Ukraine has superiority in artillery, long-range artillery, but as I said, that is contradicted by every report I've seen from the ground, and it is certainly not what the Russians themselves are saying. We also learned that it's the minefields. These are the great problem. Ukraine has problems crossing these minefields. And there's also articles that talk about the enormous Russian fortifications, that the Russians have created these elaborate fortifications, all of which is absolutely true, but there's little admission of the fact that if you're talking about the really strong fortifications that the Russians have created, the so-called Surovikin line, I haven't seen a single recent admission in any Western report acknowledging the fact that Ukraine hasn't actually reached those big fortifications. So is it really true that Ukraine is now preparing its knockout punch? Well, again, I can only speak from open source material. On the basis of what I've seen, that seems to me extremely unlikely. Most reports suggest that Ukraine has been forced to feed most of its most effective military units into the battle. It's not true that it's held back its Bradleys and its Leopard 2s for a breakthrough. On the contrary, we've seen them, as I said, burning on the steppes. It's certainly true that it has held back its Challenger 2s. They have not yet been deployed in the fighting, but there's only 12 of them, and I hardly think that that in itself constitutes a breakthrough punch. And as I discussed in my video yesterday, the Russians, for their part, seem to be increasingly confident that this offensive, that they're weathering this offensive successfully, and that the prospects of Ukraine achieving a breakthrough, a really big breakthrough, are starting to ebb away. There's been an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal which says that the West has always known that given the scale of the Russian fortifications and the Russian preparations, Ukraine has never been supplied with adequate numbers of weapons to achieve a breakthrough. Apparently, the entire expectation was that the Ukrainians would somehow make up for their material difficulties through high morale, skill, courage, better training. And of course, that has been confounded by actual events. I have to say that I think a more likely explanation is that the West fell for its own propaganda. It spent the better part of a year telling everybody and itself that the Russian military was corrupt, incompetent, poorly led, disorganized, that it had lost most of its heavy weapons, large proportions of its tanks, that it had in effect been badly knocked about and destroyed and damaged in the first few months of the war, that it was not really capable of withstanding the kind of offensive that the West was urging Ukraine to launch. And, well, having persuaded itself of that, it now finds to its dismay that its conception of the Russian army, its entire picture of what the Russian army is really like, has turned out to be completely wrong. And on the topic of supplying weapons, the United States has apparently again pushed back against suggestions that it supply the ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. There's been lots of pressure that the United States should embark on a program of supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles. But apparently the United States, or at least some people in the Pentagon, are saying that these will not change the situation on the battlefronts, and the US stockpile of these missiles is relatively small, and the Russians have successfully dealt with the HIMARS missiles, and they would quickly adapt and deal with the ATACMS missiles and probably shoot them down. And so for all of those reasons, it's probably not a good idea to supply them. And both Mark Milley and General Sims and Jake Sullivan have now all poured cold water on the whole F-16 idea. Milley, Sullivan, and all of the others are saying, well, Ukraine's problems are minefields, sending fighter jets, aircraft to deal with minefields and such things isn't going to make a huge difference because of the elaborate air defense system that the Russians have developed. Now, the last is true, but I'm going to say that the claim that air power in and of itself would be ineffective in an attack on heavily fortified lines. Well, that, based on information I was provided by members of the Duran community who are themselves former military people, well, that is simply wrong. It seems that the most effective way of breaking fortifications, of destroying fortifications, is by bombing them with heavy bombs. And given these very elaborate fortifications that the Russians have created, one assumes that the most effective way of breaking through those fortifications would be for Ukraine to operate fleets of fighters and bombers with bombs to break through the fortifications in that kind of way. The United States is not willing to commit supplies of aircraft, of fighter jets on that kind of scale for Ukraine, because it understands that the survival time of fighter jets in the Ukrainian Air Force is extremely small, and they don't want to see their F-16s shot down by Russian surface-to-air missiles and the hundreds of fourth and fifth generation fighter jets, much more advanced than the F-16s, that the Russians are deploying. So that's the reality. But anyway, no weapons, no real expectation that there will be many more weapons. According to the Wall Street Journal, an understanding that Ukraine really wasn't provided with the necessary numbers of weapons that it needed to carry through a breakthrough, and everything staked on high Ukrainian morale, training and organization, and poor Russian morale and poor training and disorganization. I have to say that if that is the kind of training that took place when this offensive was basically forced on Ukraine, well, I find basing an offensive on those sort of assumptions and knowing that you've supplied inadequate equipment to succeed in the offensive, if those assumptions are wrong, I find that negligent to the point of being practically criminal. But I won't say more. Anyway, suffice to say that for the moment, the general consensus in the West seems to be that if Ukraine isn't breaking through, this is all the fault of the Ukrainians themselves. They're not adapting or adopting the wonderful Western tactics that they've been taught in, the combined arms tactics that are needed to break through defenses. Nobody, as far as I know, by the way, has ever given a single example that I can remember or think of when Western combined arms tactics were used to break through the kind of defenses that the Russians have organized in Ukraine. But anyway, supposedly the West has these tactics. Supposedly Ukraine isn't applying them. That's why the offensive is going wrong. But the Ukrainians need to keep going because well, they must. They must keep going because it is politically impossible, either in Ukraine or one suspects in Washington and Brussels and London and Berlin, to accept that the offensive has failed. So more attempts must be made, more attacks must be made towards Rabotino, in the Vremevsky Ledge, in Piatichatki, near the Antonov Bridge, Antonovsky Bridge, in and around Bakhmut. more lives must be sacrificed, more machines must be destroyed in order to keep up the illusion that the offensive is going to succeed. And of course, we keep our fingers crossed, even as these lives are being thrown away. We keep our fingers crossed and continue to hope that perhaps something might happen. Some Russian commander might panic, some Russian unit might break, something might turn up, and that all will be well after all. And I have to say that in war, such things do happen, as they happen in every area of life, but it is reckless to gamble on them. Anyway, that seems to me to be the story of the offensive now. I should say that there are increasing discussions, not just in the Russian commentary community, the Telegram community, or pro-Russian Telegram community, but Russian community altogether, that once this offensive has run its course at the end of August, that will be the moment for Russia to go on the offensive itself. Well, we will see. As I said, they are advancing in the Kupiansk-Liman area. We'll see how that develops. But that seems to me to summarize the situation at the present time. Meanwhile, all sorts of other things are going on, and they're all tangentially connected to the war. The most important, however, is a meeting between President Putin and President Lukashenko of Belarus, which is just, well, it is in fact still underway in Russia. It is a major summit meeting, and again, very interesting, very revealing initial sets of comments by Lukashenko and Putin. I should say that Lukashenko is just about the only world leader I know of who's actually able, up to a certain point, to outshine Putin at a joint meeting, public meeting or press conference. He's an extremely ebullient and exuberant personality. And the introductory comments were a classic case of this. Putin started by discussing the introductory comments at their first meeting. Putin, first of all, welcomed Lukashenko. He talked about the stable condition of Belarus's economy, the fact that it is achieving a growth rate of around 3.7% this year, this despite the fact that Belarus is under exceptionally severe sanctions. And he talked about the fact that the two countries, Belarus and Russia, are cooperating, and he also talked up, President Putin did, the state of the Russian economy, about which I'm going to say a little more towards the end of this program. Anyway, that's how Putin started, and then Lukashenko immediately came in and he said, yes, the economy is doing incredibly well, we're doing very well in Belarus, but we have all of these threats. And Lukashenko, first of all, discussed the military situation in Ukraine. He said that he was a former officer in an armored unit, that he has experience and understanding of the kind of casualties that an army suffers if it loses the quantities of armor that Ukraine has been using on the battlefields. He said that by his calculations, Ukraine will have lost at least 26,000 men over the course of this offensive. Putin rejoined and said that, yes, that is actually roughly correct, but in fact, Ukraine's losses now are higher than that. So higher than 26,000. 26,000 was a figure that was appearing a couple of days ago. The Russians are hinting that it's more like 30,000 now in 7 weeks of fighting. 30,000, I should stress, dead and wounded. Though Lukashenko, the way he talked, it gave the impression that he thinks only that he was speaking only of dead, but it is definitely, I think, dead and wounded. So anyway, so Lukashenko says that the offensive has collapsed. Putin says no, it's still continuing, but it's failed or it's failing. And then Lukashenko talked about and took his cue directly from the various comments that Putin was making about Poland, which I discussed in my previous program. And I think it is now clear that Putin made all those comments yesterday about Poland, about Poland's designs towards Western Ukraine, that Putin made all of those comments in preparation for his meeting with Lukashenko, the meetings that are ongoing at the present time. And Lukashenko talked about this at length. He said that, yes, Poland is indeed planning to seize Western Ukraine. And he also said that Poland also has ambitions to seize Western Belarus as well. And of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, Putin has made it absolutely clear that if Belarus is attacked by Poland in that kind of way, or indeed in any kind of way, Poland is at war with Russia. That's automatic. And Putin also said that Russia would respond with all available means. And as I also explained in my program yesterday, that opens up the way for the use of nuclear weapons. And of course, Russia has now deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. So that was Putin's warning that he spoke about yesterday. Lukashenko spoke about Polish military units being concentrated near the border of Belarus. He said that one Polish unit is now only 40 kilometers from the Belarusian town of Brest. But he also said something else, and I should say that the Kremlin has not yet provided an official translation of Lukashenko's and Putin's words. But my understanding of what Lukashenko said was that if Poland occupies Western Ukraine, that is unacceptable to Belarus. Yesterday, Putin said that if Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, hands over Western Ukraine to Poland, invites the Poles into Western Ukraine, the Poles occupy Western Ukraine. This is a deal between Poland and Ukraine. Well, he said, it's none of our business, we're not going to interfere. But Lukashenko took a harder line, or what looked to me to be a harder line. He said that this would be an unacceptable act on Poland's part, at least unacceptable to Belarus. And he said that if people in Western Ukraine were to oppose and resist this, he said, or appeared to say, that Belarus would be strongly inclined to come to their rescue, would come to support them. And there's clearly going to be a discussion between Lukashenko and Putin about this. And Lukashenko also discussed the arrival of Wagner fighters in Belarus. And he said that those fighters are straining at the leash. They want to advance into Poland. They're particularly interested in attacking Rzeszów, which is this major hub of supplies and communications to be sent from Poland into Ukraine, and that he's having to restrain them. And on this, he might actually not be entirely wrong. There's recordings which have now appeared. John Helmer has discussed them extensively on his website, Dancing with Bears. There's recordings which have appeared of Wagner leaders, Prigozhin, but perhaps more importantly, a man called Utkin, who is a military officer, the only military officer, by the way, who, within the Wagner group, who, to my knowledge, actually supported Prigozhin in his attempted coup of a few weeks ago. Anyway, Utkin gave a speech to the Wagner fighters in Belarus, which met with resounding applause from those fighters, at least according to the recording. And he seemed to say that some big event is on the horizon, that Wagner is coming back and it's going to launch a big fight very soon. And it was maybe just a sort of pep talk to fighters who've obviously gone through a lot recently, the fighting in Bakhmut, the humiliation of the failed coup and all that. Maybe Utkin was trying to raise their morale. But if you take it literally, if you take what he said literally, it would be consistent with Lukashenko's comment that Wagner is straining at the leash, that they want to be unleashed on Poland, that they want to move west towards Rzeszów and settle scores with the Poles there for the fact that apparently Polish fighters played a big role in the fighting in Bakhmut, and that a lot of equipment that Wagner had to fight in Bakhmut originated, or at least came via Rzeszów. So anyway, that was what Lukashenko said. Now, Putin himself, unsurprisingly, wasn't prepared to be drawn on any of this. We'll see what happens. We'll see what Poland actually does, whether Poland does, in fact, move into Western Ukraine over the next weeks and months, as has been talked about an awful lot, but as even senior Russian officials like Putin and as Lukashenko are also saying. And we will also see whether this does expand into fighting between Poland and Belarus. And of course, Putin has now made it clear if there's an attack on Belarus by Poland, then Russia will immediately intervene on Belarus's behalf. But of course, we now have the possibility of Belarus intervening in Western Ukraine against Poland, based on what I understand that Lukashenko said. It's all very interesting, and I have to say, very concerning. It suggests that as we are moving closer to what might very well be the end game, assuming, of course, that Ukraine's offensive does eventually end in failure, as Putin and Lukashenko both suppose, that the situation in the West is becoming more tense and things are becoming more dangerous. And it's astonishing how little comment there has been in the West, in the Western media, amongst Western officials, about these statements of Putin and this latest statement of Lukashenko. I mean, it's not been ignored. There's an article about it in The Guardian, for example. But I don't think this issue is gaining anything like the kind of attention that it ought to be. We've had Putin say that if there's an expansion of the war into Belarus, Russia and Poland could find themselves in a war, and he's made it as clear as it's ever permissible to make it, that Russia would be prepared to use nuclear weapons in that war. we've had Lukashenko talking about possible fighting between Belarus and Poland in western Ukraine. And all of this, were things to work out like that, would mark extraordinarily dangerous escalation in the war. And one would imagine, one would suppose, that this would be the biggest topic of discussion in the Western media now. Helmer, who has covered all of this very, very thoroughly in Dancing with Bears, he says that a Russian military official has spoken to him anonymously and has expressed incredulity at the extent to which the West seems to be ignoring these statements of Putin, and one can now add Lukashenko as well. They don't seem to be taking them very seriously. Can I say that they should be taken extremely seriously indeed? And I would like to believe that the phone lines between Washington and Warsaw are busy, and between Berlin and Washington are also busy, and between Berlin and Warsaw as well, and that people are trying to tell the Poles, don't even think of doing what Putin is suggesting. We do not want an escalation of the war. I have to say that the silence, the relative silence, not complete silence, that there's been about all of this, makes me wonder whether either some people have taken their eye off the ball, or, which would be extremely worrying indeed, whether the phone lines between Washington and Warsaw and all of those other capitals are indeed actually buzzing, but the message is not show restraint, don't do anything reckless in western Ukraine. You've heard Putin's warning. Whether the message is instead is ignore what Putin is saying. He's only bluffing. Go ahead and do what you like, and we are fully behind you. I would say that anybody in Poland who believes the last is being incredibly complacent. We see how the United States, according to the Wall Street Journal, pushed Ukraine into an offensive against fortified Russian positions with inadequate numbers of weapons, and is proving very reluctant to supply weapons like F-16s and ATACMS to Ukraine also, for good reasons, by the way. Given that kind of reluctance, how can Poland confidently believe that if it gets involved, if Poland gets involved in some kind of a crisis with Russia and Belarus in western Ukraine, or indeed western Belarus, or anywhere like that, that the United States and the other Western powers would really be at its back? Anyway, that's the situation on the battle lines in the war. The Lukashenko-Putin discussions are interesting. As I said, we are approaching the end game, perhaps. The end game, as I've said before, in chess is extremely difficult. I suspect that in this war, it is difficult and dangerous as well. Anyway, I said I would say a few things about the Russian economy. The Russian central bank increased interest rates by 1% from 7.5% to 8%. And the Russian central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, gave an explanation, and it was a most interesting one. Briefly and straightforwardly, she said that growth is now so strong that there is a real danger that the economy might soon overheat. She said that there's tentative signs that inflation is now starting to rise again. It's gone up from around 2.5% to around 3.5%. Not a huge increase, but she said a concerning one, and that's why she's increased interest rates. She said that the economy is now growing so fast that it's sucking in imports, something that sucking in imports at a high level, and there's shortages, there's various shortages of goods in the supply chain and of skilled workers as industry struggles to keep up with demand. And she's taken the step, therefore, of raising interest rates by 1%. And she's given herself the room to raise interest rates even more. And she's also, by the way, increased the forecast for the growth rate, Russia's growth rate this year. It's now between 1.5% and 2.5%. So we can see that she's now having to deal with the problems of growth. She also says that the economy is going through a very complex process of adjustment, that industries are still working through the supply chain issues caused by the sanctions. I mean, they're successful in general in doing that, but there's still things to do. And that's why she doesn't want growth to get out of control this year. And the overall story that she spoke about is of a renewed surge in consumer confidence. And it is this huge uptick in demand which is now causing stresses within the economy. Now, that's an extraordinary contrast to the situation last year, when I remember Russian officials were saying that the problem that they were facing was a collapse in demand, that consumer confidence had been badly hit by the sanctions, and the demand had fallen back so far that there was a serious risk of the economy plunging eventually into deflation and conceivably even a deflationary recession. Well, we've got from that position last year to a position where confidence is surging, demand is surging, and Nabulina has felt herself obliged to raise interest rates in order to cool things down. A former head of the US Federal Reserve, when the US Federal Reserve actually did function like a central bank, once said that the function of a proper central bank was to take away the punch bowl before the party really got, well, too overexcited. And we see that this is what Nabulina has done. Now, I think that Nabulina is always someone who takes inflation very seriously, and she's not prepared to let inflation get out of control. And I think there is a risk that, as she has done on previous occasions, she will go too far in that direction and raise interest rates too high. I mean, inflation is now on an annualized basis at 3.5%. Interest rates are now at 8.5%. We have real interest rates in Russia at the moment, in other words, of around 5%. Most people would say that is a pretty tough monetary policy overall, and one which, by the way, I'm confident will cool things in the economy and bring inflation down. But just take a step back and think. Nabulina has the freedom to increase interest rates by 1%. She's able to do that. She's not worried about a recession. She's looks forward, considers inflation risks. She's prepared to increase interest rates before inflation takes off. In the last 2 years, Western central banks have been raising interest rates after inflation took off. They didn't expect it to take off, even though we on the Duran said it would. They didn't expect it to take off. They delayed raising interest rates, and then they've had to raise them much more than they would otherwise perhaps have needed to do, because they took their eye off the inflation ball. Well, we see that Nabulina isn't worried about doing that, and she's able to have interest rates at 8.5%, 5% real interest rates. She's still confident that the economy will grow. In fact, she's almost certainly right about that. She says that the economy could grow 2.5% this year, despite interest rates of 8.5%, 5% real interest rates. Where is that possible? Where does that ever happen in the West nowadays? And by the way, alongside all of that, and coming back to the supply issues, lots of reports about Russian technological innovations. They've just launched their first satellite, which is ultimately intended to create an alternative or a rival or an analog, perhaps, to Elon Musk's Starlink system. They've working to establish a similar type of network of low Earth satellites that can reproduce what Starlink does. They've also announced large orders for the new MS-21 narrow-bodied civil jet that the Russians have been working on for some time. And the Institute of Lithography under the Russian Academy of Sciences has prepared equipment, has announced that it's completed work on a pilot lithographic system that will enable Russia to produce microchips at the same level as the most advanced microchips currently produced by Taiwan. Now, I know lots of people are going to be skeptical about all of these technological advances. The microchip thing, I suspect, is going to cause lots of scoffing, especially. The Russians, all of these reports about these advances, they all speak of them coming into their own in the late 2020s, so we're some distance from that. But everybody I know talks about, not everybody, but some people I know, most people I know, the bulk of the commentary about all of this is going to say that all of this is nonsense, it's not going to happen. I say that we've had too much scoffing about what the Russians are capable of doing. We've seen that time and again. Claims, for example, way back in 2014, that the denial of technology to the Russian oil industry would result in rapid falls in Russian oil production, and that never happened. We've seen how the sanctions didn't achieve the effects that that the West expected. Instead of an economic implosion, we see Nabulina worrying instead about the economy overheating. I, for one, certainly on the civil aviation side, fully expect that the Russians will be successful in what they're doing. And for the record, I think the same is probably most likely to be the case with their alternative to Starlink and with their efforts to get advanced microchip production going as well. Notice that this is being done by the Academy of Sciences. In other words, this is a government-funded and ultimately administered program. It's not being left to private industry. This is the Russian way. When the Russians get round to doing something, in my experience, they do it, and they do it well. Anyway, as to that, as to the last points, I'm sure I'm going to get some pushback. We shall see more over the course of time. It will take us some years to see whether all of these developments really materialise. But in the meantime, on the military fronts, the situation is, as always, a bogged down offensive by Ukraine, bogged down at a huge price in lives lost, an incremental offensive by the Russians, major strikes at Odessa, which might conceivably be preparations for something big there, who's to say? And based on the comments that Lukashenko and Putin exchanged with each other, the storm clouds are now gathering over Western Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Russia. The storms of war, as I said, are gathering, and the West, judging by the media, isn't paying any attention. Well, more from me soon. This is where I end today. Let me remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop, buy yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.